we go. Well, I want to start out by saying I don't think biotechnology has been foreshadowed by science fiction very well, at least until recently. At least, what we call hard science fiction, that kind of technically realistic imagination of future technology has been slow to develop when it comes to biology. So a great example of this is thinking about space travel versus how biology looks. Edgar Allan Poe wrote a story about a trip to the moon in a hot air balloon in 1835, and he had a lot of realistic details about ballooning, but the premise was absurd. In 1949, science fiction authors were foreshadowing moon travel much more realistically, and so I would argue we are currently a little more like Poe. So as an example, one of the greatest geneticists of the 20th century, J.B.S. Haldane, had a science fiction speculation, but he made the claim that we really don't know much about biology right now, but we shouldn't be too modest in our speculations. So he went ahead and speculated from kind of a base of ignorance in this essay called Daedalus. Published in 1924, it was written in the form of a history of eugenics written by some future student in 2073. Haldane called them a few obvious developments, but in fact, I think they were rather lazy speculations about human reproduction turned over to a eugenic program in 1990. Although he did make a pretty prescient observation, I think, is that biological inventions are often viewed as perversions, and Aldous Huxley proved him right. He took Haldane's vision and wrote it up as a dystopia in Brave New World where where humans live in this genetically engineered society. And although Haldane got a few things right, we can genetically screen embryos for a few traits these days, I think overall there are grim prospects for a rationally designed human breeding program right now. So a recent paper shows that if you wanted to breed tall humans, you're better off using Victorian statistics than modern genomics at this point. However, I've been talking about technical plausibility, but that's really not the only possibility for foreshadowing. I think there's another important way that science fiction foreshadows future technology, and that is sort of the ethos or our attitudes towards that technology. And a great example is William Gibson's seminal 1984 cyberpunk novel, Neuromancer. So in this novel, Gibson imagines cyberspace and multinational corporations and hackers battling out over access to information. But in fact, Gibson didn't know much about computers or networks when he wrote it. People complained it's not realistic, you'll never have enough bandwidth. And Gibson said, well, I scarcely knew what bandwidth was. So if you look at his vision of what cyberspace was supposed to look like, kind of a virtual reality type thing, it's very different from our much more prosaic text-based internet today, internet hacking. However, the ethos of cyberpunk strongly influenced the countercultural attitudes towards the internet. So what about 21st century biology? Are we getting a better hard biological science fiction that really is carefully thinking about future technical challenges? And then what about the ethos? Are we seeing kind of the cyberpunk countercultural ethos applied to biology? So a great book that does both is Windup Grill by Paolo Bacigalupi, who envisions this post-fossil fuel, globally warmed world where calories are incredibly scarce. Calories take the form of genetically modified crops that are owned by multinational corporations and governments. And there's gene hacking and gene theft. And so it's a really compelling world. The author said he came up with this world because he's very interested in agricultural corporations and the idea that they might own the genetics of our food supply. And so given that Windup Grill looks like our world might look in some ways a few decades down the road, that is a very compelling question. The author said, we didn't necessarily have to wait till this moment in time to start asking these questions. It's been a while. Science fiction authors need to bring offstage questions on stage, questions about where does our food come from, where does the energy come from, where are the building block materials. So in Bacigalupi's world, calories are scarce. How are we doing today? Do we look anything like that? So far, our calorie budget is keeping pace. We don't do very well distributing it. And this is thanks to continual agricultural innovation, but how long can we keep that going? So a few weeks ago, I wrote an article about the fact that we just need to keep running just to stay in place. And the question of how climate change will affect our ability to innovate agriculturally is still a very open one. So the world of Windup Grill is certainly parts of it are very well within our future. And so if that future starts to happen, what if genetically modified genetic engineering plays a larger role in our food supply? Well, actually, these are already questions we're facing. You know, who owns the genetics for genetically modified organisms? And so in this case, I think biology has actually foreshadowed science fiction in a sense. John Clute has kind of picked up on this theme, the author of the Encyclopedia for Science Fiction, who says, writers of speculative fiction have always been interested in biology, but only in the last few decades have they really begun seriously thinking about biotechnology. On the other hand, as I mentioned, technical plausibility really is not the only way that science fiction foreshadows biotechnology. So what about the ethos? What about our attitudes towards corporations owning all the genetics? Well, there's an emerging subgenre of science fiction called biopunk, taking kind of the countercultural cyberpunk ethos and applying it to biology. And we even have some real-life biopunk going on. So Canadian futurist Andrew Hessel asked the idea, what if we could hack cancer? What if people working in their garages could hack cancer and give away the cures for free? It's a nice vision. Unfortunately, I think at this point it's completely unrealistic and implausible, but the ethos is there. The attitude we should have towards technology is there. And maybe here's a place where our attitude, our ethos, can merge with technical realism. Who's going to own the genetics if GMOs play a big part of our future? Well, why not make the genes open source? So I think there's a lot here, both for biotechnologists and for science fiction authors to think about.
All right, thank you.